as for the Soviet times, it was a very strict regime. It was a total state, totalitarian state. Unlike, in the current world, we really have just one, that type of a state. It's North Korea. It was the regime that wanted to control not just your way of life, but the way of thinking. And that's what defines one of the definitions of the total totalitarian state. However, there were people who were able to smuggle books inside the country. The books which were published outside the country, Solzhenitsyn, which was totally forbidden in the Soviet Union. But even names, I don't know whether you know about, there was a famous poet, Anna Akhmatova. She also was banned in the Soviet Union. Anyway, Orwell, of course, Animal Farm, 1984, all those books, they were smuggled inside the country. They were printed on a very thin paper. Reading the books could get you in jail for 3 years, and distribution of those books could get you in jail for 7 years. However, people were reading this. People, were listening to BBC and Radio Liberty, even though, of course, they were forbidden inside the country, but there was ways and means always, how to get to listen to them. There were, at the time when I grew up, there was already, resisting was building up. I remember at some point my dad caught me in the kitchen reading one of the Solzhenitsyn's, The First Circle, his famous book, The First Circle, during the night. And of course it was, illegal copy, and I kept it in the corner of my room underneath, the wood. And Dad told me, that if they, of course it's up to you. You can read this, but you have to understand that if they caught you, Mom will get fired, I will get fired, your sister, my sister was a TV presenter at the time, and she was a member of the Communist Party, which I never was. She will get fired, and it will be a disaster for the entire family. So it was a very covered life. You lived double lives. You went to the university, and at one lecture, we were learning about the great Soviet writers which were purged during the Soviet Stalinist purges, and the next lecture will be about, the Communist Party orders against famous Soviet writers. But, I was lucky. It wasn't, Stalinist years were gone. The regime was much more vegetarian, and yes, of course, I knew my limitations. It was impossible for me to travel abroad. They didn't give me exit visa and foreign passport until 1990. There was no way for me to make any career in the Soviet times. But, it was okay. It was okay with me. I think you should, whenever I think about Brazil, I think that I really can relate to the history of this country during the dictatorship, and you can understand our story well better than many people in the world.
Sim. Qual é a diferença essencial na prática jornalística sob o regime soviético e na prática jornalística sob Putin?
These are two different types of regimes. Under Soviets, it was a totalitarian regime, and so there was a strict control over everything that people could think, could write, could read. Under Putin, they couldn't care less about what you think, or until the last couple of years. As long as you don't go for protests, as long as you don't write that Putin is a as a son of a bitch who basically subverted, the democratic process in Russia, that he annexed Crimea, that he occupied the eastern part of Ukraine, etc. As long as you are loyal to the clan in power, they couldn't care less about you. In the Soviet times, there were censors that existed in each and every paper. I was writing on science. I was writing a lot on, on the results of the space flights and the research that was done on the Soviet space stations. Or there was special censor who was sitting in my paper. He had, a lot of books. His name I remember, still, Sergei. And I was coming to him, and I was pretty young, and I was trying to seduce him so I will be able to get this line or this fact into printing. And I rarely succeeded. We couldn't write about the Stalinist purges all the way till 1988. It was totally forbidden thing in the Soviet Union.
Até 88.
I'm sorry?
Era proibido falar sobre o Stalin até 88.
No. About purges? No.
Oh.
It was 1987. That was the beginning of glasnost era. And that's when, 1987, I published my first article on the KGB. Before that, all these things were totally forbidden. I couldn't write that XYZ, the famous XYZ person was sentenced in 1937, then shot. It was totally forbidden. I couldn't write, I couldn't name, certain cities in the Russian Federation because there were military installations there. And so you understand, in the Soviet Union, 75% of the economy were directed to the needs of the military-industrial complex. 100% of all ferry metals productions, 75% of all, non-ferry metal productions, the black metals, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was totally militarized economy, and at the same time, it was impossible to buy basics. I became extremely well known when I ran a series of articles that was called under the title "Reporter Gives Birth an Assignment." I just, I did a story about what was it like to be pregnant in the Soviet Union when, men probably, you may not know this, but, women tend to grow here and here, and for this you need special clothing that didn't exist in the Soviet Union. Even though, we were able to send people to the space, but, the basic productions, the basic needs that women had, they were not satisfied by the Soviet industry. So in Putin's time, at the beginning of his term, of his first term in 2000, he and his people. First of all, it's important to understand that it's not just about Putin. We say Putin, Putin, Putin. It's not just about Putin. It's about the people in epaulets, the graduates of the Soviet Union's political police, the most powerful and the most repressive institution of the Soviet Union, which got into power in 2000. Unfortunately, people who chose Putin as successor to the first president of the democratic Russia, Boris Yeltsin, they were ignorant enough not to understand that loyalty of one KGB man doesn't ensure that the entire corporation, entire institution is going to be in the same fashion. In Russia, this is KGB people, who graduates of the KGB, now it's called FSB, but it doesn't matter really, who control the most important spheres of the political and economic life. They control all the major industries, banking, finances, telecommunications. Of course, all electronic media this way or another. They're in charge of 10 biggest state-owned or state-affiliated corporations. They're in charge of oil and gas sector, etc. They run at least 25 agencies in the country. So it's a corporate state. It's a corporate type of regime, very closed in the decision-making sphere. It's almost impossible to get through. In a way, it's harder than it was under Soviets to figure out what's going to happen in the country. And this is it's also, graders of the KGB, they have this specific, very conspiratorial mindset. They're totally, they're enemies to any conception of human rights, liberties, freedoms. They're very statist. They understand that they feel themselves as being, the protectors of the state, and therefore they consider themselves to be this state, people who do understand what's important in order to make Russia great again, to say.
Como é que foi depois do fim da União Soviética e antes da ascensão do Putin? Houve um pouco mais de liberdade para a imprensa, para a sociedade? O controle era menor ou não? Foi sempre mais ou menos esse padrão que você está descrevendo para agora?
Yeltsin's regime was very corrupted. As probably it's unavoidable when it comes to privatization of huge assets that were created during the Soviet times. Soviet Union had a very developed economy. It was a post-industrial state. It had a lot of assets. Unfortunately, the major part of the economy was unconvertible because it was built to suit the needs of the military-industrial complex. There were oligarchs, people who managed to acquire huge chunks of the Soviet property for close to nothing, and they had a huge influence over the decision-making sphere. Having said that, when you have multiplicity of business interests and big business interests, they don't allow for one ideology to exist. They don't allow for one set of ideas to exist. They're in constant competition with each other. When they have different interests, and therefore they want to promote their interests. In order to do that, they need media. They want their interests to be heard by people who make the decisions. So therefore, during the Yeltsin's times, there were the diversity, the multiplicity of different media outlets. I wouldn't say that they were independent. I never worked for any of them. I worked for the Newsweek International, and I was doing investigative journalism, and I was predominantly working on my own. And it was a great time of my life. I was making enough money to study, to go through Harvard, and to do my investigation, etc. However, there were a lot of freedoms. Yeltsin believed, even though he was a former party apparatchik, but still, Boris Yeltsin believed in the freedom of speech. There was no one case when Yeltsin called some, owner of the paper or owner of the network and said, I'm going to destroy you. He believed that independent media are a necessary vehicle for creating the new developed, modern, Western Russia.
Houve algo, do ponto de vista econômico, político ou social, que na passagem dos anos 90 para os 2000 permitiu ao Putin e ao grupo dele acumular poder, centralizar, reforçar o poder do presidente e do seu grupo?
To answer in short, oil prices.
Okay.
Oil prices, you're well aware about this, in Brazil as well. But that was, this oil dependency. That was, that what allowed Brezhnev regime in the Soviet Union to survive for more than 18 years. And that's what, gave the huge financial benefits to Putin's. They were able, we know the way this system works, that, loyalty in exchange for social benefits. That the major tricks that is used by that type of regimes. You suggest people some social benefits, you raise the basic salary so that people are not starving, you allow for some retirement compensation, in exchange for the loyalty of these people. And Putin was very successful in this, I mean, it is, Putin successfully used this instrument to enrich his own oligarchs. He destroyed the majority of the Yeltsin's ones, and he created his own oligarchs.
A Rússia hoje tem pouquíssimos veículos independentes. Talvez um ou dois, não sei. Echo, Radio, maybe. E New Times.
One paper, Novaya Gazeta, one weekly, The New Times, one cable TV channel, Dozhd, Rain, one radio station, Echo Moscow.
Echo.
That's it.
É pouco.
That's all left.
E é pouquíssimo. Os jornalistas, de modo geral, os jornalistas russos, eles estão satisfeitos com essa situação, acomodados com essa situação, ou você entende que no grosso da categoria profissional há um incômodo, uma vontade de reverter essa situação? Como é que é do ponto de vista do conjunto dos jornalistas?
Obviously, there is no such a thing as journalists in general,
Claro.
People, have their own interests, and there are some good journalists who became very complacent and who chose to become Putin's puppets. They receive very good salaries in exchange for that. I think that, anyway, I'm not going to go into their motives, but anyway, there are journalists who left the profession, who went to all kind of, they're trying to teach, they're doing some research, they went in GRs and PRs and etc. And there are some who are still left. For the independent outlets, it's impossible for us to compete in terms of salaries, of course. So some reporters, who are writing for me, for instance, they choose to write under fake names, under pseudonyms. They don't want to create problems for their families. When KGB goes against you, like let me tell you about Alexei Navalny. He's a good friend of mine. There is no one member of his expanded family left that were not searched by the secret police people, whose computers were not taken away, computers, laptops, phones, and etc. So it is quite, you need to have balls in order to be a political journalist in current Russia. Mm-hmm. And you have to be, and one thing is a must. You should understand the risks involved. You are not going to be rich or wealthy. Your life is quite risky one, but it's great fun, Mm-hmm. When I was teaching, my courses were closed. They decided that I'm too dangerous to be anywhere near the students. And I was teaching institutional theory and theory of the political regimes, and I always was telling my kids about the Vargas regime in Brazil in 1940s, and I kept telling them that, look, I was telling this story how one of the closest people to President Vargas, conducted a coup d'etat against Vargas, and I kept saying that that's the fate that Putin is going to see. One of his own closest pupils, his students, his first lieutenants, will turn his or her back against him. In our line of work, the most important thing is to protect your sources. Therefore, I never put names of my sources, neither in the notebook nor in my computer. It's only here. Mm-hmm. Never, just never, ever. You don't do this mistake putting, any name in your gadgets or in it. But other than that, let them know about my life as much as they want.
Sobre Estado policial, como é, de certo modo, a Rússia hoje, as redes sociais são benéficas para regime repressor, para Estado policial, ou não?
Yes and no.
It's a great answer.
Exactly. For social networks, Facebook and Twitter, they were instrumental in 2012 protests in Russia, and still that's the way for opposition across the country to connect. YouTube has become a substitution for the Russian TV, which is nothing but a propaganda machine. Each and every network controlled by the state, and each and every network just lie about the basic facts in Russia and in the international politics. In fact, they don't talk about Russia. They talk about Ukraine all the time, and of course, United States, which is enemy number one on the Russian national security agenda, as it was back in the Soviet times, the same way. The United States were enemy number one. So, however, Russian state is very capable in using trolls, in using people who work in order to conduct a smear campaign against anyone who is against Putin. There is a special facility built in St. Petersburg, the place called Olgina, which is the troll factory, yes, I mean, hundreds of people are hired, predominantly young people. They're hired to write tweets, to attack members of the opposition or people from the independent media, anyone who is disloyal to Putin on Twitter and on the Facebook. However, they now, all of a sudden, they realized that young people turned away from the state propaganda machine and started creating their own video on YouTube. And the leader of the Russian opposition, Alexei Navalny, created his own channel, which has been watched by, there are more than 3 million subscribers. His documentary on the corruption of the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, got already something like 28 million views. And of course, nothing on that was shown on the Russian propaganda TV. So now, according to the stats, the audience of the Russian propaganda TV is shrinked significantly. It covered, 90% of households all across Russia's 11 time zones. And now, Channel 1, the biggest one, has an audience of some 5 million people, and the mean age of these people is 60 plus. In fact, that's Putin's constituency, women 64 plus. I'm serious. We don't know exactly, because pollsters no longer exist in the country, sociology no longer exists in the country. So, and of course, in the authoritarian regime, people tend not to answer honestly to the questions posed to them by the pollsters. So all the statistics that you hear that Putin has support of 82 or 86%, God, nobody knows, of course, And if he has that support, why they're putting the Alexei Navalny and other members of the opposition in jails?
Eu queria, na verdade, sair da influência ou do governo Putin usando redes sociais dentro da Rússia e discutir o grande tema do momento nos Estados Unidos, que é o uso que hackers russos teriam feito das redes sociais para tentar influenciar a eleição americana, quer dizer, usando públicos-alvo que favoreceriam Trump, isso está sendo discutido, investigado nos Estados Unidos, e que prejudicariam a Hillary. Você acha possível que essa atuação mude o curso de uma eleição? É possível que uma ação desse tipo mude o curso de uma eleição?
First of all, I should say that we yet to see the hard proof. We're journalists, and therefore we cannot be satisfied by what we read in the American media. When you talk to people in the United States, and I was in Washington in early September, they do tell you that in order to disclose the hard proof that prove that Russians were involved in hacking the democratic process in the United States, revealing this information will reveal the sources that American intelligence has in Russia, and that's totally impossible. That, of course, creates a lot of problem for us, for journalists. However, we do know, first of all, we do know through the history lessons that Soviet Union tried to interfere in the American elections in 1984. Andropov, the former head of the KGB, the then head of the KGB, the then leader of the Communist Party, the head of the state, and the former head of the KGB, ordered 3 residenture in the United States, in New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, to conduct a smear campaign against Ronald Reagan, who ran for the second term. The result was that Reagan had a landslide victory. 49 states voted for Reagan. So it was a total failure for the KGB back then. However, KGB was known for conducting active measure operations all across the globe, especially in the third world countries, especially in the countries where the Soviet Union had interests in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, and etc. So we do know that these kind of tactics, this kind of things, were used by the former KGB. We also know that a couple of hacking groups that were mentioned in the media with respect to hacking the email of the Democratic National Committee in the United States were connected and are connected to the military intelligence that is GRU. For instance, Fancy Beer. Now, if you ask me, do I think that Russians were involved in hacking emails and trying to hack electoral machines in 35 states in the United States? I will say yes, I do think that they're capable of that, and that there was a desire, if not to install a Russian puppet into the Oval Office of the United States, but to create a chaos and to show to the outer world that democratic process in the United States is no different than in Russia, where it is totally corrupted, and that you can, so bringing chaos to the process, that I think was the major idea. However, I think there were some Putin's people who were selling to him the idea that they can put a person who is loyal to Putin himself as the president of the United States. Now, what was the purpose? Of course, Russians do understand that they're unable to run they're unable to run the country as big as the United States. The idea was that the new president who is loyal to Putin will abandon sanctions. Russia suffers, Russian economy, Russian banks suffer tremendously from the sanctions that were imposed by Barack Obama. First, as a response to Russian annexation of Crimea, and then as a response to a Russian de facto occupation of the eastern Ukraine. Russian businesses through the entire 2000 years were running on cheap Western money. Interest rate, when you borrow money in the West, it is 3-4% plus Libor, so it is around 6-7% interest rate. If you borrow money inside Russia, it is all the way from 14 to 22% interest rate. It's impossible to run business, or the money are so expensive inside Russia that it's just impossible to run it unless you have assets and financial system of the state, of the Russian state. Therefore, the sanctions that were imposed on the Russian banks and on the Russian companies that they're no longer able to borrow money in the West became very painful to Putin's oligarchs. And in fact, if you talk to people in Washington, D.C., you will learn that Trump was going to do it, or supposedly, allegedly, let me be careful here, allegedly was going to abandon sanctions against sectors of the Russian economy by the executive order. Therefore, Congress of the United States put these into law. It was totally unexpected by Kremlin. In fact, when Trump got elected, there was a celebration all across the bureaucratic agencies in Moscow, and especially in the so-called law enforcement, in the police, in the offices of the police, the KGB, etc. There was celebration, as if Trump was becoming the president of the Russian Federation. It was so funny.
Como é que os jornalistas e esses órgãos independentes na Rússia fazem para enfrentar essas campanhas de desmoralização, de acusação e etc. do poder? Como é que vocês reagem a isso nas redes sociais?
I don't think, I'm not a politician, I'm a journalist,
Sim.
So, I know the only way, I know how to write stories, how to edit stories, and I do believe that our job is to bring truth to the people, to let people know about what's going on. And, there is an American saying, to tell truth to power. That's our job. We have to get the information out. I really believe that it is a constitutional right of my fellow citizens to have the full information about the way power structures and authorities operate in my country. that's what we do, and we keep doing it. I don't know any other way around. You know, yes, of course, we use Twitter. Yes, of course, we use Facebook. Yes, of course, we try to put, you know, pieces of the stories both on the Facebook and, you know, headlines on Twitter. Yes, we try to get readers engaged. The most important thing is what I see as a very important thing for me personally to do is to let people know that they shouldn't be afraid. That you can say what you say and you're alive. You know, I always say, you know, wait a second, you know, I never censor myself. The hardening of the situation in Russia makes me be more radical than I tend to be. But I do it precisely because people in my country, they have long history of repressions, and they tend to become afraid. You know, the minute somebody says, oh, KGB, then they say, oh, God, you know, Zhenya, please don't talk about this. Zhenya, you know, it's, people are afraid, and people are not supposed to be heroes. People want to have their normal lives, and that's okay. You just have to somehow to translate to people, to try to show them that there are really no reason to be afraid. Putin is not Stalin.
O seu jornal, The New Times, parou de circular na versão impressa, né? Vai ser só online.
Yes, we ran out of money.
É realmente um problema só econômico ou teve alguma pressão política falsamente revestida de questão econômica?
You know, in our types of the regimes, economy doesn't exist without politics. Of course, it's, you know, when we say economy, we mean politics. Because I can tell you how, you know, we experienced the slow suffocating of our business. First of all, the owner of the magazine worked out in 2013 because the business of her son was threatened by the authorities. The New Times was the most radical political magazine in the country. We were running stories about Putin's business, about his closest entourage, about, you know, all kind of clandestine operations they were running, about, you know, their offshore accounts, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So she walked out, you know, the owner of the New Times walked out. One day, January 9, 2013, she asked me to her office, and she said that no one issue will go out anymore. And I said, wait a second, you know, we have subscribers, you know, we have people who are buying the magazine, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, you know, we cannot run this business anymore because, you know, they threaten my son, he said, my son with his life. By that time, one of my reporters was already deported. And the day she was deported from the country, she happened to be citizen of the former Soviet Republic, Moldavia. The last advertiser walked out of the magazine pages. Whenever I speak or spoke to business owners of the big businesses or medium-sized businesses in Russia, they say that to give ads to New Times is to say publicly, I am against Putin. Russia has a very little experience in democratic process. And precisely because of that, democratic politics in our countries, in my country or in my type of, in the countries like Russia, are predominantly elite politics. politics they decided in the capitals, in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. Putin regime is trying to eliminate all the political forces from the political scene. Now, is it beneficial to the ordinary people, to the rank and file, to live under democracy? Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, because Soviets didn't allow me to go abroad, I traveled all around Soviet Union back in the 80s and 90s. You know, people were so damn poor. Of course, one of the things that happened during the last 20 years that, you know, the incomes went significantly up. The kind of life that Russians have now, they never lived as well as now. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is that, you know, market economy, capitalist economy came into being in Russia. Yes, I do believe that democratic process, accountable government, is beneficial to the development.
Mas você acha que o governo Putin vai acabar de maneira democrática? Ou é possível que ele chegue a um fim por um processo democrático ou não?
Unfortunately, I doubt. I think that we crossed this threshold when we had a chance to change the regime via democratic means. I think that we will face some elite coup d'etat. Mm-hmm. So I doubt. I'm afraid that we are yet to hit the bottom, that we're facing quite difficult times. But after all, you know, I should say that we journalists are partially responsible for what happened. There was much of corruption during the Yeltsin's time among the government officials, but there was a lot of corruption in, you know, of journalists as well. Mm. And we're, you know, and Moscow elites and, you know, educated people with some understanding, you know, unfortunately, they failed. We failed. It's a very unpleasant thing to say, but, you know, after all, we should learn lessons that we got after, you know, out of, you know, this very short period of democracy in Russia. You know, we're responsible.
O que é que você acha que o jornalista deixou de fazer?
There are things that they shouldn't done. They shouldn't take money from oligarchs.
Oh.
They shouldn't be running covered ads. They shouldn't get engaged in all this, in all these games that, you know, a lot of them were involved in.